We often look at the really big picture stuff when we talk about economic growth, things like government policy or maybe major tech breakthroughs.
Right, the macro view.
Exactly.
Mm.
But what if the real engine, the thing actually driving progress, like how we get more productive, what if it comes down to just a surprisingly small number of key companies?
Mm.
If you're listening because you want to get up to speed quickly on what really moves the needle in the economy, maybe get a few of those aha moments, then yeah, you're definitely in the right place today.
Absolutely. And today's deep dive gets right into that. We're looking at a really compelling report from the McKinsey Global Institute. It's called The Power of One: How Standout Firms Grow National Productivity.
The power of one. Yeah.
Yeah, and it kind of pushes back against the idea that national productivity is, this tide that just lifts everyone equally.
Right.
Instead, it suggests, it argues pretty strongly that a small group of companies are actually the ones disproportionately fueling economic progress.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to pull out the main insights from this report, really get under the hood of how productivity growth happens, like at the company level.
And what that means for the wider economy.
Right. And we want to lay it out clearly, give you the essentials without getting bogged down in too much jargon or overwhelming detail. Think of it as your fast track to understanding this.
Exactly. And to figure this out, the McKinsey team looked at a pretty hefty data set. We're talking about 8,300 large firms.
Wow.
Across the US, Germany, and the UK. And they focused on 4 really key sectors: retail, automotive, and aerospace, travel and logistics, and computers and electronics.
Right, the big ones.
The big ones, yeah.
Yeah.
And the main period they studied was 2011 to 2019. But what's interesting is they also did a sort of follow-up check with a smaller set of data from 2019 to 2023.
Did it hold up?
It seems so, yeah. The basic patterns, these fundamental dynamics, they appear to still be true more recently.
Okay, interesting. So you mentioned the report highlights these things called standout firms, productivity bursts, and something called dynamic reallocation. These sound like the core ideas.
They really are.
Before we jump into the details, can you just give us a quick, what do these terms actually mean in this context?
Sure. So standout firms, think of them as pretty large companies that either make really meaningful jumps in their own productivity, or they significantly grow their share of employment, starting from a point where they were already, better than average.
Okay, so they're making waves.
Big waves, yeah. They're the ones really pulling the average up for the whole economy. Then you have productivity bursts. That's basically these periods where these leading firms experience really rapid, substantial growth in the value they create, not just incremental tweaks.
Like a sudden surge?
Exactly, a surge. And finally, dynamic reallocation. This is about how resources, especially people, labor shift towards these more productive firms. And often that goes hand in hand with less productive firms shrinking or even closing down.
Got it. Standouts, bursts, and reallocation.
Those 3 concepts are really key to understanding this whole power of one idea.
So the big headline seems to be that this productivity growth, it isn't like a slow, even spread across the economy. It's concentrated. How concentrated are we talking?
Yeah, it's actually pretty striking. Across those 3 countries, the US, Germany, UK, they found that just 2% of the firms they studied, only 2%.
Just 2, wow.
Were responsible for a huge 63% of the total positive national productivity growth during that 2011 to 2019 period.
63% from just 2% of firms.
Astonishing, isn't it? It really makes you question that traditional picture of, small improvements happening everywhere adding up.
Totally.
This suggests it's much more about these focused pockets of really high performance. It's not a slow burn. It's more like concentrated bursts of energy.
That 2% figure is really something. So these standouts, are they just the biggest companies?
Yeah.
Or the ones that are already, the absolute most productive?
That's a really good clarification. No, the report is quite clear on this. Standouts aren't necessarily the single most productive firms overall.
Okay.
And they aren't always the ones growing productivity the fastest either, percentage-wise. Often, the firms with the absolute highest productivity, like, say, revenue per employee, might be smaller, really niche businesses.
Oh, I see.
Think about maybe online game distribution platforms within retail. Super high revenue per employee, maybe, but their total impact on the national economy is limited by their size.
Right.
Standouts are big enough and their gains are significant enough to actually shift the needle for the whole country's average.
Okay, makes sense. And on the flip side, you mentioned stragglers. Is negative growth also concentrated?
Yes, unfortunately it is. They identified this group they call stragglers firms that are basically pulling the average down significantly.
Ah,
In the U.S. sample, for instance, another 2% of firms, these stragglers, accounted for 57% of the negative productivity growth.
wow. So it's really these outliers at both ends having a massive impact.
Exactly. A relatively small number of companies at the top and bottom are disproportionately shaping the overall national productivity story.
Okay, so these standouts are driving the growth.
Yeah.
How? You mentioned productivity bursts. That sounds, well, more dramatic than just getting a bit better each year.
Yeah, and that's one of the really interesting findings how these gains happen. It's usually not this slow, gradual adoption of best practices across the board.
Hmm.
Instead, it often happens in these more intense bursts. It's when companies figure out and then, crucially, scale up completely new ways of creating value.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about Apple moving heavily into services, the App Store, Apple Music, iCloud. That wasn't just, making slightly better iPhones. It was a whole new value stream.
Right, a different business model almost.
Exactly. Or consider EasyJet and how they really defined the discount airline model in Europe. Or Zalando, pioneering large-scale online fashion retail. These weren't just efficiency tweaks.
They were fundamental shifts.
Fundamental shifts in what they did and how they did it. The key is discovering something new and scaling it. Growing what works and growing it big.
So it's less about just tightening belts or optimizing the current way of doing things. These standouts are making really bold, significant strategic moves.
Precisely.
What kind of strategic actions did the report find were common among these firms that led to these bursts?
Well, the report boils it down to 5 key types of strategic moves that standout firms often make. The first one is scaling more productive business models or technologies.
Okay.
Think of Amazon building out its massive fulfillment network. That scale allows for incredible efficiency. Or Zalando rapidly expanding its e-commerce platform across Europe. That's scaling a productive model.
Right, using tech or a new model and just hitting the accelerator. What's number 2?
The second key move is shifting their regional and product portfolios towards the most productive parts of their business.
So focusing their bets.
Exactly, like General Motors deciding to exit certain less profitable international markets to focus on stronger ones, or, say, a company like Zeiss really pushing growth in high-potential regions like Asia-Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
Even tech examples fit here, like Broadcom shifting strategically towards infrastructure software, or Apple expanding heavily into accessories and services, which are very profitable for them. It's about actively managing the portfolio. Focus on the high ground, you could say.
Interesting. So not just doing things better, but really choosing what to do and where. What's the third strategy?
The third one is reshaping their customer value propositions to grow revenue and what they call value added. Basically finding new ways to give customers something they value more and are willing to pay for.
How does that look in practice?
It can be different things, like the Home Depot significantly boosting its customer experience both online and in stores, or Tesco, the UK retailer, improving its range of premium food offerings. Even airlines like Delta or American in the US adding more value-added services for their loyalty members. Or on the product side, think of NVIDIA creating GPUs that became essential not just for gaming, but for AI. Or Airbus with its super successful A320 family of jets. It's about giving customers more of what they actually value.
Got it. Really dialing into customer needs and innovating there. What about the last 2 strategies?
Okay, the fourth is building scale and network effects. This is classic platform stuff sometimes. Amazon and Zalando, again, bigger platforms attract more users and more sellers, making the platform more valuable for everyone. That's a network effect.
Right, the virtuous cycle.
Exactly. But it's also things like Hapag-Lloyd growing through shipping acquisitions, or U.S. airlines consolidating, creating bigger networks, and using larger, more efficient planes. That's upgauging. Even Apple's super efficient global supplier network, or NVIDIA building its CUDA software ecosystem around its chips, those are about building scale and network effects too. Bigger often really is better here.
And the final piece, strategy number 5.
The fifth one is transforming operations to raise labor efficiency and reduce external costs, but doing it at scale. This is probably what many people think of first with productivity cost-cutting programs like Tesco implemented, or EasyJet updating its fleet to more fuel-efficient planes.
The classic efficiency drive.
Right. But the report stresses that while this is important, it was rarely the main driver for the standouts they studied. It often supports the bigger strategic moves.
So it enables the other stuff.
Often, yes. And a really crucial point the report makes is that the biggest impact comes when firms pursue multiple of these strategies together in combination. Optimize relentlessly, but as part of a bigger plan.
This is fascinating. It really paints a picture of strategy and market positioning being maybe more important than just optimizing what you already do.
I think that's a fair takeaway.
Now, the report also talked quite a bit about reallocation. How does the movement of, people and resources fit into this productivity story?
Yeah, this is absolutely critical. Productivity growth isn't just about good companies getting better in a vacuum. It's also massively influenced by the flow of resources, especially employees moving towards those high-performing standout firms and away from or out of the less productive ones.
So the standouts create the bursts, but then the rest of the economy kind of shifts towards them.
That's a big part of it. The movement of resources really amplifies the impact of those standouts.
And you mentioned earlier there was a difference here between the U.S. and Germany, U.K.
Exactly. The data showed the U.S. had much more dynamic reallocation of labor during this period. Meaning successful productive firms tended to grow their headcount more, while less productive firms were more likely to shrink or even exit the market completely.
And that mattered for overall growth.
Hugely. This reallocation effect accounted for almost half of the total productivity growth measured in the U.S. sample.
Half, just from resources moving around.
Pretty much. Specifically, the growth of those top frontier firms added about 0.6 percentage points to U.S. productivity growth, and the exit or shrinking of unproductive firms added another 0.5 points. So overall, reallocation was responsible for adding 0.9 percentage points to the total 2.1 percentage points of growth they measured in the U.S.
Wow. And Germany and the U.K.? Less so.
Much less so, yeah. In Germany and the UK, there seemed to be less of this dynamic shifting. The report suggests there was more of a tendency perhaps to preserve or support underperforming firms, those stragglers. So the contribution from reallocation to overall productivity growth in Germany and the UK was actually negligible during the same period.
Any thoughts on why?
The report points towards potentially more flexible factor markets in the U.S. labor markets, capital markets allowing businesses to start, scale up, or, yes, even fail more quickly. It certainly raises questions about, the impact of different policy environments on this kind of dynamism.
So it sounds like having a more fluid labor market where people can move more easily to winning companies is actually a really important ingredient for national productivity growth.
The evidence here strongly suggests that, yes.
Now, okay, productivity growth sounds great for the economy overall. But what about for, say, the average employee? Does this translate into better wages? Or does it all just go to profits?
That's a key question, absolutely. And the report suggests it's generally positive. It frames productivity growth as potentially being mutually beneficial, good for employees, good for customers, and good for shareholders.
How so?
Well, fundamentally, higher productivity means a company is generating more value per worker. That gives it the capacity, the ability to afford faster wage growth. It also increases its potential for profits.
Okay, the potential is there. Did they see it actually happening?
Interestingly, yes. Especially in the German-UK sample, they found the link between productivity growth and wage growth was actually stronger than the link between productivity growth and profit growth over that period.
Oh, that's quite encouraging. So workers did share in the gains.
It appears so in their sample, yes.
And what about customers? Do we see benefits there too?
Yes, the report also notes that sectors with faster productivity growth tend to generate more consumer surplus. That could mean lower prices or maybe better quality products or just more innovative stuff becoming available. So the benefits do seem to spread out.
This whole deep dive has really offered a pretty different way of looking at where productivity growth comes from. If you had to summarize the big shifts in thinking this report is arguing for, what would they be?
Sure. I think there are about 6 key shifts. First, focus less on the broad average and more on the impact of a, relatively small number of standout firms.
Right, the 2%.
Second, emphasize bold strategic actions and the market's response to them, rather than just focusing on companies imitating existing best practices.
Okay.
Third, prioritize the big picture strategy, portfolio choices, creating new customer value maybe over just tweaking internal operational efficiency, although that's still important, of course.
Yeah.
Fourth, recognize that scaling innovation within established firms often has a bigger aggregate impact than just new companies entering the market. Fifth, Really appreciate the crucial role of dynamic reallocation resources flowing to the leaders.
The U.S. example.
Exactly. And sixth, just understanding that productivity growth often happens in these significant bursts, not just smoothly and gradually over time.
Those are definitely big shifts, challenges a lot of the standard thinking. Now, the report also talks about what this means for, business leaders and policymakers. It doesn't give all the answers, I assume, but what are the key questions raised?
Right. It raises more questions than it answers, but they're important ones.
Yeah.
For business leaders, it's things like, how do we actually create the conditions inside our company to become a standout, or stay one if we are?
Yeah, good question.
How can big, established companies stay agile enough to make these bold moves? What kind of leadership fosters that? How do we really use new tech like AI, not just for efficiency, but to drive real value creation and growth? And for policymakers, it brings up questions like, how can we best support the emergence and growth of these potential future standouts? What policies actually help or hinder that dynamic reallocation of resources we talked about?
Right, the labor market flexibility aspect.
Yeah, and how do you balance supporting these leading firms with ensuring, healthy competition in the market? It also touches on things like talent strategies, the role of M&A, and building innovation ecosystems. Lots to think about.
These are definitely complex issues, no easy answers there.
Not at all. But these findings give us a different framework for thinking about them.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful, really digging into the how of productivity growth beyond the headlines.
Agreed. This power of one idea, this concentration of impact, it's a really powerful lens for understanding economic progress.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener. As you go about your week, maybe start looking at companies and industries through this lens. Who seems to be making those bold strategic moves we talked about?
Yeah, who looks like they might be one of these standouts?
Can you spot firms that are really reshaping their market or customer value? Think about how their actions might be echoing some of these patterns and ultimately shaping the economy we'll all be living in.
It's a really fascinating way to connect these big economic trends back to the specific actions of individual companies. Makes you see the business world a little differently.